Hello, everyone. I'm Tanya Rivero. We begin with some breaking news. Israel and Hamas have agreed to terms for a ceasefire. This despite an ongoing barrage of rockets being launched by both sides. The AP reports the Israeli Security Cabinet has approved a unilateral ceasefire to halt an 11-day military operation in the Gaza Strip on Thursday evening. Israeli officials say Hamas backed the ceasefire, which is expected to go into effect beginning at 2 a.m. on Friday. The news comes after more than a week and a half of violence in the region. Leading up to the ceasefire, Israeli Defense Forces exchanged attacks with Hamas on Thursday morning. For more, let's bring in Lahav Harkov. She is a senior contributing editor and diplomatic correspondent at the Jerusalem Post. Lahav, welcome. What more do we know about the parameters of this ceasefire, and when did the two sides come to an agreement?
So it's not a ceasefire in the traditional sense. There's not a signed agreement between Israel and Hamas. There have been repeated rounds of fighting like this, and this is sort of how they always end. Hamas is, of course, a U.S. designated terrorist group. Israel also recognizes them as a terrorist group. So the negotiations take place through a lot of intermediaries. And in this case, it was mostly negotiated by Egypt. It's an unconditional cessation of hostilities. Both sides have agreed to it. It's going to go into effect in about 3 hours. I can tell you that the Israeli Security Cabinet, which is sort of a smaller than the general government cabinet that makes decisions on matters of major security issues, they agreed to it unanimously. The Israeli military felt that it had reached its objectives and that it has deterred Hamas from shooting at Israeli civilians. In the past less than 2 weeks, Hamas has shot over 4,000 rockets into Israeli civilian centers.
So the ceasefire will reportedly not go into effect until early Friday morning. Why not just make it immediate? And what kind of damage could be done between now and then?
Well, it's early Friday morning Israel time, so that it's really in 3 hours. In theory, the reason that it's not immediate is that Hamas doesn't have full control of all of the other smaller terrorist groups that are in Gaza, the major of which is Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And so Hamas needs to sort of send the message. That being said, having gone through many rounds of this in the past 15 years, we know that Hamas generally shoots a sort of final salvo, a major barrage of rockets usually into Israel's south, sending about 1 million Israelis into bomb shelters. And so we should just expect a lot of rockets in the next few hours before this goes into effect.
Is there a chance anything like that, though, could endanger, then, this agreement?
It could. I think that it's expected at this point. And so, if they go very, very far and do more than what more or less has come to be expected, then it could endanger the ceasefire. And in fact, the Israeli Security Cabinet's message said that the continuation will be reflective of the reality on the ground, is the words that they use. And I think that we can understand that as meaning that Israel will respond to what Hamas does, or as Israeli security officials used to say, quiet will be answered with quiet. If Hamas stops shooting, Israel will stop shooting.
And so, Lahav, what comes next in all of this? I mean, I imagine both parties will have to respond to the UN after these past few weeks. What comes next in terms of some sort of long-term agreement and long-term peace?
Well, it would be great if Hamas had to respond to the UN, but Hamas is a terrorist group. And they don't respond to the UN. And bizarrely, the UN tends to ignore them. I mean, there was no UN Security Council resolution on this escalation of violence because the U.S. repeatedly blocked it, saying that it was detrimental to the ceasefire negotiation efforts. However, the draft that was being drafted did not even mention Hamas, even though they were the ones attacking Israel. So the UN has proven to be blunt, somewhat useless on this matter. The problem, unfortunately, is somewhat intractable. Hamas is, an Islamist group that runs the Gaza Strip. Their sort of constitution, their founding document calls for the destruction of Israel. They don't want to negotiate a two-state solution. And the Palestinian Authority, which is in the West Bank, at least theoretically wants to negotiate a two-state solution with Israel. And so if there's any kind of peace, it would come through them. But Hamas is always this additional factor that, Israel has the military strength, right? Israel is thought to have the strongest army in the Middle East. So Israel could defeat Hamas theoretically. However, there would be a lot more casualties. It would require, Israeli soldiers to enter Gaza, and the casualties would be on both sides, and Israelis don't really have a desire for that for the most part, which is why we keep having these sort of cycles coming up every few years where there's violence, and then Israel bombs a lot of Hamas bases, and then, there's quiet for a couple of years, and then Hamas pops up again.
What implications could regime change on both sides or on either side, have? Because, as we know, Netanyahu's administration is not solid at the moment, and neither is Hamas among Palestinians. So both administrations could conceivably be on their way out. What could that mean for the future of Palestinian-Israeli relations?
I don't think that you can compare Prime Minister Netanyahu's government to Hamas. Again, as I said, Hamas is a terrorist organization. It is true that they won an election 15 years ago.
I know that. Of course they are. Of course they are a terrorist organization. I'm not trying to put them on equal footing, but I'm just saying in terms of peace in the region, if there's a change on both sides in leadership, what could that mean going forward?
Sure. So on the Hamas end, if there's a change of leadership, there was supposed to be a Palestinian election in 2 days. It was supposed to be on Saturday, a Palestinian parliamentary election. It was called by the Palestinian Authority, whose headquarters is in the West Bank, which is separate from Gaza, right? And it was then canceled because Hamas was polling quite well. That was one of the reasons, at least, that it was canceled, although not the officially stated one. So as far as Gaza is concerned, after Hamas did well in the parliamentary election 15 years ago, that was the last one, they basically murdered political leaders from other parties and have banned all other political activity, that's not related to Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And so it's difficult to say what kind of regime change there could be. I mean, they're a tyrannical regime, and I hope for the Palestinians that they are able to get fair representation that doesn't oppress them. But I don't see a specific horizon for how that's going to happen. Now, in Israel, we just had our fourth election in less than 2 years. We have too much democracy in Israel. And Prime Minister Netanyahu was not able to form a governing coalition. And so our opposition leader, Yair Lapid is his name, he is now tasked with forming a coalition, and he's having some difficulties as well. If I had to bet on it, I actually think the most likely scenario is that we are going to go to yet another election. But it is possible that there will be an alternative government to Netanyahu. Most of the sort of political wrangling was put on hold for the past 11 days while this operation went on, but I imagine it will pick up in full speed in the next couple of days.
All right. Lahav Harkov in Jerusalem, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.